Hey, what's up everybody? Jason here. Thanks for checking out the channel today. So I'm going to go over how to use reusable elements and nested reusable elements. And that's going to help with two things. Number one, it's going to make your Bubble app smaller. Number two, it's going to make it easier to maintain. So reusable elements basically operate the way that you would think. It allows you to build something once and reuse it in multiple spots. So if you think of WordPress, if you've ever used WordPress, you can add widgets to pages and you can set some properties for that to display those widgets in certain different ways. Reusable elements are basically the same thing. So I built most of this off camera because I did actually record this and built it live, but it was just getting too long. So I thought what I would do is I would walk you through the thought process of how to do it and then show you actually how to do it even though it's already built, to keep this tutorial as short as possible. Drop comments below if you would rather see live builds that are a little bit longer or if you'd rather see something like this. So if you remember, this Build Stuff channel is about helping people that are new to Bubble or maybe tech founders who are not that technical get the most out of no-code stuff. So let's get into it. I'm going to use the same artist management system that I've been using for all of my tutorials. So first, here is basically how things are set up. This is a good practice to go through when you want to use reusable elements, and you can just do a little bit of planning to try to figure out how you want these things to be displayed. So I have my data things. So I have an artist table, a track table, and an artist group table. And what I want to do with the artist group table is use this basically to create an unlimited list of artists. So let's just say I was doing a radio show and I wanted to feature 3 artists. I could create that group. If I just had a feature on the website, I could create a different group, and then I could use the same reusable element basically and just change the data that's being passed to it. So if I look at some of the ways that I want to display the data, this would be a good thing to go through as well. So depending on the type of site that you're running, think about the types of lists and the types of displays that you want to have. And that would really help you figure out your use case for using these reusable elements. So I'm obviously going to have a text-based list. So if you go to an artist section, you'll see the whole list of artists. I do want to have some feature area where it's going to be cards or big hero features. I also want to have a small featured list, which it's kind of splitting the difference between these big cards and this long list. And then also maybe some other type of latest track feature that I want to be able to display. So here's how I've decided to structure the pages and the reusable elements. There's pros and cons to both. There's a bunch of different ways that you can think about this. So you can have your repeating group on the outside of your reusable element. You can have it on the inside. There's pros and cons to both. For this purpose, I'm going to have my repeating group inside the element, which means I'm going to set the data inside each of these elements based on properties. Now, the first thing to talk about with reusable elements is the difference between using properties and custom states. So properties are things that you will set in the Bubble editor, and if you want to change those, you need to redeploy your app. Custom states are a little bit more dynamic, although you can use dynamic values and properties. But if you need to pass information to and from your reusable elements and your nested reusable elements, custom states might be a better way to do this, because at the time of recording this, you can't dynamically set a property. So for example, if you wanted to click a button in your UI to change from a list view to a card view, you would have to use custom states to do that. Now, you could set the property value to be the value of your custom state, and then set the custom state, and your property is always going to adjust based on that. But it kind of defeats the purpose. You would just use a custom state to do that anyway. So there are a little bit of limitations if you're going to use properties versus the other one. I'll show you a little bit of both, and then you can decide the best way to build this for your app. So I have my group on the page, and I'm going to have multiple groups on the same page, a list of text artists, a list of cards, and a list of features, basically. So the blue boxes here are the reusable elements, and I have what I'm calling an artist list. And it's important to name these things in a way so you won't get confused. So I'm choosing to name my reusable elements after the type of data and then what function that reusable element serves. So this is for my data type of artists, and I'm going to be showing a list of them. These are the properties I'm going to use for this one. So display type is going to allow me to set card view or list view, and limit is going to be how many records do I want this thing to show. Now inside that reusable element, this is where I'm going to have multiple groups. And I can have as many as these groups as I want inside this reusable element. So I'm going to have a text view list, a card view list, and those are being displayed based on the display type that I set here, and I'll show you more about that in a second. Now I've chosen to just put my repeating group inside here, so I'm going to have multiple repeating groups, which might not be the most efficient, but to keep this tutorial as simple as possible, that's the way that I've done this now. And then here's my nested reusable element. So this is where if I'm setting a list or a card type, I'm going to be able to show the right display basically for the artist. So there's an artist list and then there is an artist item. Here's what the public page looks like. So all three of these boxes are using the same reusable element, and all of the artist displays are a nested reusable element inside of it. So the top one here, I have this set to card view. I have this set to get the artists from this group, which I'll show you that in a second, and I only want to return one record. This one is just set to card view and it's limited to showing 2. This one is set to list view and there's no limits on the records being returned. So let's take a look at the hierarchy first. So here's the page, and these are all the reusable elements that are on the page, and these are the properties that I've defined. So the list view is determining what type of display it gets used, so I can set this between card and list. Display number is how many tracks are being returned. So if you remember on this page, this is showing 1. If I go back and change this to 2, then reload this page, it's now going to show 2 of the featured artists up there. And also I have a list type. Now list type is what determines whether or not it does a search for artists based on a group of tracks. So first let's take a look at the artist group table. So I do have my artist table here. This is just a list of all of my artists, and I have an artist group table, which basically just has a group name and then a list of the artists that are inside of that group. I'm using the slug to decide which of these lists to pull. So one thing, if you're going to use this kind of join table approach to it, just figure out either to grab the artist group by the unique ID or the slug. Slug is probably the safest because then you can change the group names if you want to use that, or a description, and it's always going to pull from the slug. So if I go back to my design view and into my artist list, here's the properties that are set on the artist list reusable element, list view, the display number, and the list type. So when you create properties for your reusable element, you get a few different options. You can choose from dynamic value, color picker, or checkbox. The dynamic value can be just about anything. So you can set this to option sets, you can set this to data types or basic types. You could also choose to make this a custom state as well. So basically anything you want to set in that property, you can do that. And you can also set defaults, and you can also make these optional as well. So for example, this list view here, I have this set to optional so it doesn't have to be passed, but it's always going to default to list. So it's important to do that because you'll never have to worry about a list being empty. It's always going to default and just show a text-based list if you don't set that property on another page. These two parameters are not optional, meaning you'll get a little warning up here if you haven't set that on the page, and that's just to, this one is to limit the number of records that gets returned, and the list type is optional because I want to show a list of artists that are inside of a group if I've passed a group to that widget. And I'll show you how to do that conditional logic in a second. Now, just to talk a little bit about why I chose to put the repeating group in this reusable element over and over again. Number one, it's simpler for this tutorial, or it's more simple for this tutorial. And number two, it gives you a little more freedom around how you choose to arrange your reusable element. So what I mean by that is if I'm on my website somewhere and I want to make a change to my featured artist list for whatever reason, I know I can go right to this area and then I can go into this repeating group and set these parameters for however I want. So maybe I want to increase this to 200 by 200. I can do that here because, you know, I've got them all set here separately. Now you can set some repeating group things dynamically, but for my purposes, this just makes it a little bit easier to deal with. So if you notice inside all of these repeating groups, there's also my other reusable element, and this is the artist item. So this is what shows the display of that artist. And I have this one very simple. So it's just going to show what view that you want to use. So that's controlling whether or not you're seeing a card in here or if you're seeing a list in just the text names here. Now, the important thing to mention about this is this has to cascade its way down, meaning if I'm on the page, I'm setting the list view to card. So I want this repeating group to show cards, not a list of things. Now on my artist list reusable here, I need to make sure that this item is set to whatever my artist list view is set to. So it's going to inherit that from the parent. And then dynamically, I'll be able to do whatever combinations I want. So for example, if I wanted this feature list here to be text and not cards, that will happen simply by just changing this to list from cards. And then now if I reload the page, it's now showing a list instead. So I can have all of those different types of combinations. So I'm going to put this back to card. And again, one thing you may need to worry about is make sure, because you're typing these names in, this isn't the best way to do it. But for this tutorial, just to help you with some reusable elements, this will work from now. And then maybe you start to add more dynamic items so you have less maintenance down the road. But I always like to start as simple as humanly possible. Now let's take a look at the conditions that determine which of these groups should be displayed. So all of these are set to collapse when hidden, and none of them are being loaded on page load. So first, for the single column, the condition is when the property is set to list, show this. For my card view, this is where it not necessarily gets tricky, but this is a different condition. So when the list view is card and the list type is empty, make this visible. So for example, this is going to show just a list of artists, not artists that belong to a group. So if I'm not passing that group value, then it's just going to show all of the artists based on whatever limit it is that I set on that reusable element. And this one, this is for the featured card. So show this when the list view is set to card and the artist list type is not empty. So that's what's determining whether or not you're going to see a list of featured artists or just an entire list of artists. So it kind of separates the view from the type of content that you want in there. So the artist repeating group is pretty simple. It's just doing a search for the artists, and it's doing a items until whatever limit I'm passing to that reusable element. This one is using the exact same thing, just search for the artists. So I could absolutely reuse this in a different way, but again, for the purposes of the tutorial, this is probably good enough for now. And then my featured artist is doing a search, but it's actually going to search the artist group based on the slug that I'm passing in. So again, this is where you need to make sure that you're passing in the exact name here. If you want to be really safe, use the unique ID because that's never going to change, but that's what's controlling the features. And here's a quick view of my artist item, and this is basically just two different things. There's a list and there's a card view. So if the artist item display type is list, show this list view, and if it's card, set to card view. All right, to close this off, I'll just show adding a new widget to the page essentially. So let's just say I have this new track group up here that I want to use. I'm going to just copy and paste this, and I want to use the featured list instead. So I'm going to copy and paste, and I'm going to change this to featured. And then what I want is I want the card view, but I want the artist group to be featured. And I want to say limit this to 2. So let's color this differently so it will be obvious. I'm going to go here to the reusable element here. I want card view. I want the limit to be 2. but I want this to show the featured list. Actually, let's spell this incorrectly just so you can see. So obviously it's not going to show a list at all because it's not going to find that artist list. So let me go back here and rename this to featured. I'm going to go into my data thing and I'm going to make sure that my artist group is featured. Now if I reload this, so here's the two different featured artists that are in that list. So you can see the new tracks has Sherry and Clever Weapon, and the featured has these two artists instead. Now, one little bonus tutorial, you can probably see what kind of challenge you're going to have. So if I set this to list view, because I just wanted a list of featured artists. Now, if I reload this, it's going to show the same list view down here because that's the condition I set in that reusable element. Now, it is still respecting the limit. It's only showing 2. But if I took that limit away and I change this to 6, for example, and reload, it's not actually pulling. It's just displaying this same thing. So now I'm going to have to go into my artist list reusable element, and this is where I talked about how there's a bunch of different ways you can design this. What I'm going to need to do here basically is do that same condition that says if you've set it to a list view and the group you're passing is empty, show this data. If the group you're passing has tracks or artists in it, then it's going to show the different list. So in the card view, I handled this by doing this separately. So if you remember, the artist list view and card list type is empty, show that. And to show the featured cards, artist list view is card and the artist list type is not empty. So it's using those conditions to display those. Now, if I wanted to have every possible combination, I might have a little bit of a mess with creating so many different groups. So I can create the same thing here. So if I wanted to go into this list column, I could basically set the data type dynamically. So right now, by default, it will search just all of the artists and it will respect that display limit. Now I could use a condition to control this. So when the artist list view is list and the artist list type is not empty, I can set a different data source. So now I can just steal this data source from this card view, copy, go into this condition, and paste. And now when I reload the page, it's no longer going to show this exact same list. It's going to dynamically set that repeating group data. So here's the two artists that were in that feature, but it's just showing in a list. So to close this off, this will probably be the trickiest thing depending on how big your site is. One recommendation could be on your page here, you could set a custom state on your reusable element. So if I wanted to create, you know, the list of artists, I would set this to artists, I would set this as a list, and then I could probably simplify and just have one repeating group with some different conditions to set how I want that repeating group displayed. But I chose not to do this on my public site because I have too many different combinations of how I want things to be displayed, and it's easier for me to maintain it this way. So thanks very much if you watched this whole thing. I tried to keep it as short as possible by not doing a live build, but if you'd rather see this built in a live way for all my tutorials, drop a comment below and let me know what questions you have about repeating groups or reusable elements. Thanks for checking it out. See you next time.